The morning rush at Brewed Awakening coffee shop in Virginia Beach was nothing out of the ordinary. Steam rose from the espresso machine, the familiar grind of coffee beans filled the air, and customers lined up for their daily caffeine fix. Behind the counter, Sarah Chen moved with practice efficiency, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, a slight limp barely noticeable as she navigated between the register and the brewing station. To everyone around her, she was just another barista trying to make ends meet. But beneath her apron, hidden from view, hung a small bronze star medal that told a story few would ever believe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been working at the coffee shop for 8 months now, ever since she'd returned from her final deployment overseas. The transition from military life to civilian work hadn't been easy. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones now made her jump at the sound of the espresso machine's sudden hiss. The camaraderie she'd known with her unit had been replaced by polite small talk with customers who saw her as nothing more than the person who made their morning latte. She'd chosen this particular coffee shop because it was close to the naval base, hoping that being around military personnel might ease the transition. But most days, the uniformed sailors and officers who came through barely acknowledged her existence beyond placing their orders. They had no idea that the woman brewing their coffee had spent 3 tours of duty as a Navy corpsman, saving lives under enemy fire in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Bronze Star with Valor device that hung around her neck, always tucked beneath her shirt, was a constant reminder of a night in Helmand Province when everything had changed. She could still remember the weight of the wounded Marine in her arms, the sound of incoming mortars, and the decision that had earned her one of the military's highest honors for heroism. But here, in the relative safety of a Virginia Beach coffee shop, those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life. "Next," Sarah called out, wiping her hands on her apron as she looked up at the growing line of customers. The morning rush was always hectic, but today felt different somehow. There was an energy in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. Her combat-trained instincts were still sharp, even if she was using them to manage coffee orders instead of medical emergencies. A group of men in civilian clothes caught her attention near the back of the line. They weren't in uniform, but everything about their bearing screamed military. The way they stood, the way their eyes constantly scanned the room, the subtle hand signals they used to communicate. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. These weren't ordinary customers. She'd learned to read people during her military service. It had been essential for survival, knowing who could be trusted and who might pose a threat. These men had the distinctive look of special operations, probably SEALs given their proximity to Little Creek. They carried themselves with a confidence born of extensive training and countless missions, but there was also a relaxed alertness that spoke of professionals who were off duty but never truly off guard. As they moved closer to the front of the line, Sarah found herself studying their faces more carefully. There was something familiar about one of them, a tall man with graying temples and intense blue eyes. She couldn't place where she might have seen him before, but the feeling nagged at her as she continued taking orders and preparing drinks. The coffee shop buzzed with its usual morning energy. Business executives checked their phones while waiting for their orders. College students typed furiously on laptops in the corner booths, and base personnel grabbed quick caffeine fixes before starting their duty days. To all of them, Sarah was invisible, just another service worker in the vast machinery of civilian life. But those men in the back of the line kept watching her, and Sarah's instincts told her their interest went beyond curiosity about their coffee order. She'd felt that kind of scrutiny before, usually right before something significant happened. In combat zones, that feeling had often preceded either danger or recognition from fellow service members who'd heard stories about the quiet corpsmen who'd pulled wounded Marines out of kill zones. As the line shortened and the group of men approached the counter, Sarah noticed something else. The way they moved together suggested they weren't just colleagues, they were a team, probably one that had worked together for years. The silent communication, the subtle positioning, the shared awareness of their surroundings all pointed to men who'd operated in the most dangerous environments the military had to offer. The familiar weight of her Bronze Star shifted slightly against her chest as she leaned forward to clean the counter. For 8 months, she'd kept that medal hidden. Not out of shame, but out of a desire to blend in, to be normal. The hero's welcome she'd received upon returning home had felt overwhelming, and she'd quickly learned that civilian life didn't have much room for war stories or displays of military honor. Most days, she was content to let people think she was just a coffee shop worker who'd maybe done a brief stint in the military. It was easier than explaining why a decorated combat veteran was now measuring coffee grounds and steaming milk for a living. The truth was complicated, involving PTSD, survivor guilt, and a desperate need to find a purpose in a world that seemed impossibly distant from the one she'd known overseas. The group of men finally reached the front of the line, and Sarah found herself face to face with the one who'd seemed familiar. Up close, his features were even more striking, and there was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested he saw more than most people. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Good morning," he said, his gaze lingering on Sarah's face with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable. "I'll take a large black coffee, no sugar." His companions ordered similarly simple drinks, black coffee, espresso shots, nothing fancy or complicated. It was exactly what Sarah would have expected from special operations personnel. They weren't the type to spend time deliberating over flavor combinations or milk alternatives. They wanted fuel, pure and simple. As Sarah prepared their drinks, she became increasingly aware of their continued scrutiny. They weren't being obvious about it, but she could feel their eyes on her as she moved behind the counter. It reminded her of the way her commanding officers used to watch her work in field hospitals, evaluating her performance under pressure. "You know," the tall man said as Sarah handed him his coffee, "you look familiar. Have we met before?" Sarah shook her head, forcing a polite smile. "I don't think so. I'd remember meeting you." But even as she said it, she felt a flicker of recognition. There was something about his voice, the way he carried himself. A memory tried to surface from the depths of her mind, something connected to Afghanistan, to a night when everything had gone wrong and somehow gone right at the same time. "Afghanistan, maybe?" one of his companions suggested, studying Sarah with the same intense focus. "You have the look of someone who's been downrange." Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her chest where the Bronze Star lay hidden beneath her shirt and apron. She caught herself before the gesture became obvious, but not before the men noticed the movement. Their expressions shifted subtly, and she could see recognition dawning in their eyes. "You did serve," she admitted carefully, "but I work here now." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Sarah had learned that civilians often didn't know how to respond when they discovered her military background, especially when they realized she'd been in combat. Some thanked her awkwardly, others asked inappropriate questions about killing enemies, and many simply changed the subject as quickly as possible. But these men weren't civilians. They understood the weight of service, the complexity of transitioning from military to civilian life, and the difficulty of finding purpose after experiencing the intensity of combat operations. Their expressions showed respect rather than awkwardness, understanding rather than curiosity. "What branch?" the tall man asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Navy," Sarah replied. "I was a corpsman." The change in the men's demeanor was immediate and profound. In special operations communities, Navy corpsmen held a place of particular honor. They were the medics who accompanied Marines and SEALs into the most dangerous situations, providing medical care under fire and often saving lives at personal great risk. The bond between special operators and their corpsmen was sacred, forged in combat and tempered by shared experiences that few others could understand. "Doc," one of them said softly, using the traditional term of respect and affection for Navy corpsmen.
It was a title Sarah hadn't heard in months, and hearing it now sent an unexpected wave of emotion through her chest. The tall man set his coffee down on the counter and extended his hand. "Master Chief Petty Officer Tom Rodriguez, SEAL Team 6, and I think I know exactly who you are." Sarah felt her world shift as she shook his hand. SEAL Team 6, the most elite unit in the Navy, the ones who handled the most sensitive and dangerous missions. If he knew who she was, it could only mean one thing. Her reputation had reached even the highest levels of special operations. "You're HM1 Sarah Chen," Rodriguez continued, his voice filled with something approaching reverence. "The Angel of Helmand." The nickname hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't heard it since her final deployment, when Marines throughout the region had started referring to her by that name after word of her actions had spread through the ranks. She'd saved 17 Marines during a single night in Helmand Province, repeatedly running through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers and drag them to safety. The coffee shop around them seemed to fade away as the memory came flooding back. The night that had earned her the Bronze Star with Valor device had also been the night that changed her forever. She could still smell the cordite in the air, still hear the screams of wounded Marines, still feel the weight of their bodies as she carried them one by one to the medevac zone. "That's not me," she said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. The metal against her chest felt heavier suddenly, as if it was made of lead instead of bronze. Rodriguez smiled, but it was a sad smile, filled with understanding. "Doc, I was there that night. Not in your unit, but close enough to hear the radio traffic, close enough to know what you did. 17 Marines, Sarah, 17 men came home to their families because of you." The other men nodded in agreement, and Sarah realized they all knew the story. In the tight-knit world of special operations, heroic actions were remembered and retold, becoming part of the collective memory of the community. Her actions that night in Helmand had become legend, passed down through the ranks and across unit boundaries. "I was just doing my job," Sarah said, the words automatic after years of deflecting praise for her actions. "No, Doc," Rodriguez said firmly. "What you did that night went way beyond duty. You saved those Marines at considerable risk to yourself, and you did it because that's who you are. That medal you're wearing under your shirt, you earned every bit of it." Sarah's hand flew to her chest involuntarily, confirming Rodriguez's observation about the hidden medal. The gesture was instinctive, protective, as if she could somehow shield the Bronze Star from view through sheer will. But it was too late. The SEALs had already seen everything they needed to see. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time since they'd entered the coffee shop, his expression was genuinely warm, rather than professional. 23 years in special ops teaches you to read people, Doc. The way you move, the way you scan the room when new customers enter, the way you carry yourself, it all screams combat veteran. But more than that, it screams corpsman. You can't hide that level of training and instinct. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. Plus, that Bronze Star medal makes a very distinctive outline under fabric when you lean forward. I've seen enough of them to recognize the shape. The other SEALs had formed a loose semicircle around the counter, not in a threatening way, but in the protective formation that special operators instinctively adopted when one of their own was in a vulnerable position. To anyone watching from across the coffee shop, they probably looked like friends chatting with their favorite barista, but Sarah could feel the intensity of their focus, the weight of their attention. "Look, Doc," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the tone he probably used with his team members. "I don't know what brought you here, working in a coffee shop instead of practicing medicine. And I'm not going to pretend to understand what you've been through since you got back. But I want you to know something. What you did that night in Helmand, that's not something you leave behind. That's not something you hide behind an apron and hope people forget." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. For 8 months, she'd been invisible, anonymous, just another face in the civilian workforce. She'd told herself that was what she wanted: normalcy, simplicity, freedom from the weight of expectations that came with being a decorated war hero. But hearing recognition from these men, from warriors who understood exactly what she'd sacrificed and achieved, brought all those suppressed emotions rushing back to the surface. "I lost 3 Marines that night too," she said quietly, the words coming out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. The guilt had been eating at her for months. The knowledge that her moment of greatest triumph had also been shadowed by devastating loss. Rodriguez set his coffee down again and leaned across the counter, his voice intense but compassionate. "Doc, listen to me very carefully. Those 3 Marines didn't die because you weren't good enough. They died because war is hell, and sometimes good people don't make it home. But 17 other Marines are alive today because you were exactly good enough when it mattered most." One of his teammates stepped forward, a shorter man with kind eyes and burn scars visible on his forearms. "HM1 Chen, my name is Senior Chief Peterson. I served with Marines in Fallujah back in '04. I've seen what combat does to corpsmen, the weight you carry when you can't save everyone. But I've also seen what happens when corpsmen like you don't recognize their own heroism." He paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. "You're drowning in here, aren't you? Hiding behind this job, telling yourself you're better off invisible. But that's not living, Doc. That's just existing." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, as if a dam that had been holding back months of suppressed emotion had finally given way. These men saw through her carefully constructed civilian facade, saw the warrior who was slowly dying behind the coffee shop counter. They understood the isolation, the sense of disconnection from purpose, the weight of carrying memories that civilians could never comprehend. "I don't know how to be anything else anymore. I don't know how to be a hero when I feel like such a failure." Rodriguez exchanged glances with his teammates, and Sarah could see some kind of silent communication passing between them. When he looked back at her, there was determination in his eyes that reminded her of mission briefings, of moments when special operators made decisions that would change lives forever. "Doc, what if I told you there was a place where you could use your skills again, where being the Angel of Helmand wasn't just a memory, but a living reality that could help other people?" Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of place?" "We run a program," Pedersen explained. "Veterans helping veterans. We work with guys coming back from deployments, struggling with the transition, dealing with the same demons you're fighting. They need someone who understands, someone who's been where you've been, a corpsman who knows what it's like to save lives under fire and carry the weight of the ones you couldn't save." The coffee shop around them seemed to buzz with normal morning activity, but Sarah felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff looking down at a future she hadn't dared to imagine. For months, she'd felt purposeless, disconnected from the sense of mission that had defined her military career. The idea that her skills, her experience, even her pain might be valuable to other veterans was terrifying and exhilarating. "What would I have to do?" she asked, her voice stronger now, carrying a note of the decisiveness that had once made her legendary among Marines in Afghanistan.
Rodriguez leaned back slightly, his expression becoming more businesslike as he shifted into recruitment mode. "First, you'd have to want it, Doc. Really want it. This isn't about us needing another warm body. We need someone who understands that helping other veterans heal is a mission just as important as any you undertook in Afghanistan." Sarah found herself nodding before she'd fully processed his words. The idea of having a mission again, of using her skills and experience for something meaningful, sent a jolt of electricity through her system that she hadn't felt since leaving the military. "The program is called Phoenix Rising," Pedersen added, his voice taking on the tone of someone describing something he deeply believed in. "We work with veterans who are struggling with PTSD, survivor's guilt, addiction, suicidal ideation, all the stuff that the VA sometimes can't handle or doesn't understand. We use peer counseling, adventure therapy, medical support, and most importantly, we remind these guys and gals that they're still valuable, still needed. A customer approached the counter, interrupting the conversation momentarily. Sarah mechanically prepared a cappuccino, her mind racing with possibilities even as her hands went through the familiar motions. When the customer moved away, she turned back to the seals with renewed focus. "Why me specifically?" she asked. "There are other corpsmen, other decorated veterans who could do this work." The third seal, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. He was younger than the others, probably in his early 30s, with a kind of intense focus that suggested recent combat experience. Because HM1 Chen, most decorated veterans don't know what it's like to feel like failures despite their heroism. Most of them don't understand the specific kind of guilt that comes with being unable to save everyone. His words hit Sarah like a precisely aimed arrow. This man understood exactly what she'd been going through, the complex mixture of pride and shame that had been tearing her apart for months. "My name's Lieutenant Jake Morrison. I lost my entire team in Syria 3 years ago. IED took out our vehicle, and I was the only one who walked away. For 2 years after that, I couldn't understand why I deserved to survive when 6 better men didn't make it home. I tried civilian work, tried pretending the war was behind me, tried drinking my way through the guilt." He paused, his eyes distant for a moment before refocusing on Sarah. "These guys found me in a VA parking lot at 3 in the morning, sitting in my truck with my service weapon, trying to decide whether I had the courage to pull the trigger. Phoenix Rising saved my life, Doc. But more importantly, it gave me a way to honor my fallen teammates by helping other veterans find their way back from the edge." Sarah felt her chest tighten with recognition. She'd never gotten as far as Morrison had in his despair, but she understood the weight he described, the crushing sense that surviving when others didn't somehow made you responsible for their deaths. It was a burden that civilian therapists and well-meaning friends couldn't possibly understand. "The veterans we work with," Rodriguez continued, "they need to see someone who's walked through the fire and come out the other side. Not unscathed, nobody comes back from combat unscathed, but functional, purposeful, still fighting the good fight. They need to see the angel of Hellman and understand that even angels sometimes fall, and even fallen angels can learn to fly again." The coffee shop's morning rush was beginning to wind down, and Sarah noticed that fewer customers were coming through the door. Her manager, Janet, was probably going to want her to start the deep cleaning routine soon, but for the first time in months, Sarah found herself reluctant to return to the mundane tasks that had been filling her days. "What would the work actually involve?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of professional interest that hadn't been absent for too long. Pedersen smiled, recognizing the shift in her tone. "Medical support for veterans dealing with physical and psychological trauma, peer counseling with guys who are struggling with the transition to civilian life, crisis intervention for veterans who are in immediate danger of self-harm, adventure therapy programs where we take small groups into challenging outdoor environments and help them rediscover their strength and purpose." He paused, studying Sarah's expression carefully. "But mostly, Doc, it would involve being yourself. Being the woman who ran through enemy fire 17 times in one night to save Marines. Being someone who understands that heroism and pain aren't mutually exclusive, that you can be both a decorated war hero and a struggling veteran at the same time." Sarah felt something stirring inside her chest, something she hadn't experienced since her final deployment ended. It was the feeling of possibility, of purpose, of being needed for something more important than brewing coffee and taking orders. For months, she'd felt like she was slowly disappearing, becoming smaller and more insignificant with each passing day. But these men were offering her a chance to matter again, to use her skills and experience in service of something greater than herself. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "How many veterans does the program work with?" Sarah asked, her mind already beginning to shift into mission planning mode.
Currently about 40 active participants, Morrison replied, but we have a waiting list of over 200. The need is enormous, Doc. We're losing more veterans to suicide than we lost to combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. The VA does their best, but they're overwhelmed, understaffed, and frankly, sometimes they just don't get it. Rodriguez nodded grimly. 22 veterans commit suicide every day in this country. 22. That's more casualties than most combat units take in an entire deployment. And the ones who don't kill themselves are often dying slowly from addiction, isolation, and despair. The statistics hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd heard the numbers before, but somehow they carried more weight when delivered by men who were actively fighting against them. The idea that my fellow veterans were dying at home, defeated by enemies they couldn't see or fight in conventional ways, filled her with a familiar sense of urgency.
The medical side of the program is where we really need someone with your background, Peterson continued. A lot of these guys have physical injuries that aren't healing properly because they're not taking care of themselves. Depression, addiction, and isolation all interfere with recovery. They need someone who understands both the physical and psychological aspects of combat trauma.
Sarah's mind was racing now, processing the possibilities and challenges of what these men were proposing. The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person, but it also felt terrifying in its implications. Accepting would mean stepping out of the safe anonymity she'd built around herself and back into a world where her actions mattered, where people's lives might depend on her decisions. "Where is the program based?" she asked, her voice steadier now as she shifted into information-gathering mode. "About an hour north of here," Rodriguez replied. "We have a facility on a 100-acre property in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It includes medical facilities, counseling centers, dormitories for residential programs, and outdoor adventure course areas. It's far enough from urban distractions to be therapeutic, but close enough to civilization that we can get people to hospitals if needed." The description painted a picture in Sarah's mind of the kind of place she'd dreamed about during her darkest moments. Somewhere peaceful but purposeful, where the skills she developed in combat could be used to heal rather than just to survive. She could almost see herself there, working with veterans who understood her experiences, using her medical training to help people recover from wounds both visible and invisible. The position would come with full medical and dental benefits, Peterson added, recognizing that practical considerations might be weighing on Sarah's mind. "Housing is available on-site if you want it, or we can help you find something nearby. The salary is competitive with civilian medical positions, and there's room for advancement as the program continues to grow." But Sarah found that the financial aspects of the offer were less important to her than the sense of purpose it promised. For 8 months, she'd been earning just enough at the coffee shop to cover her basic expenses, but she'd been spiritually bankrupt, slowly dying inside from lack of meaningful work. "What about training? I know medicine and I know combat trauma, but I don't know anything about counseling or therapy." Morrison smiled, and Sarah could see approval in his expression at her practical question. "That's exactly why we want you, Doc. You're not trying to pretend you already know everything. The best peer counselors are the ones who understand their own limitations and are willing to learn." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "We'd send you through a 6-month training program in trauma-informed therapy, crisis intervention, and peer counseling techniques. You'd work alongside therapists and social workers, but your primary value would be as someone who's lived through what our participants are experiencing." Rodriguez nodded. "The technical aspects of counseling can be taught, Doc, but what you bring to the table, the credibility that comes from having been in combat, having saved lives under fire, having struggled with your own demons and survived, that can't be taught. That's what makes the difference between someone who's just doing a job and someone who can genuinely help other veterans heal." Sarah felt a familiar sensation in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced before important medical procedures during her deployments, a combination of nervousness and excitement, fear and anticipation.
It was the feeling of standing at the threshold of something significant, something that could change not just her own life, but the lives of others. "Can I think about it?" she asked, though part of her mind was already calculating how quickly she could give notice at the coffee shop and start the transition to her new life. "Of course," Rodriguez said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a business card. "But Doc, don't think too long. Every day you spend behind this counter is another day that 40 veterans don't have access to the kind of help you could provide. And more importantly, it's another day that you're not living up to your own potential." The card was simple, just Rodriguez's name, rank, and contact information, along with the Phoenix Rising logo, a stylized bird rising from flames. Sarah stared at it, feeling the weight of the decision it represented. "There's something else," Peterson said, his voice taking on a slightly hesitant tone. "The program is funded partly by the VA and partly by private donations, but we're always struggling financially. Taking this job wouldn't just be about helping individual veterans. It would be about proving that peer-based programs work, that they're worth expanding and replicating across the country." The stakes were even higher than Sarah had realized. She wouldn't just be helping the veterans in their program, she'd be part of a larger effort to change how the country approached veteran mental health care. The thought was both inspiring and daunting. "One last thing," Morrison added. "The veterans we work with don't just need medical care and counseling. They need to see examples of people who've made it through the darkness. They need to see the angel of Hellman and understand that if she can find her way back from despair, maybe they can too." Sarah looked around the coffee shop, taking in the familiar sights and sounds that had been her world for 8 months. The espresso machine, the display case full of pastries, the chatter of customers discussing their mundane daily concerns. It all suddenly felt incredibly small and insignificant compared to what these men were offering. She thought about the Bronze Star medal hanging around her neck, hidden beneath her apron like a shameful secret. For months, she'd treated her military service as something to be minimized, something that marked her as different and potentially troubling to civilian employers and acquaintances. But these seals were reminding her that her service, her sacrifices, and even her struggles were valuable, not just as personal experiences, but as tools that could be used to help others. "How soon would you need an answer?" she asked, though part of her mind was already calculating how quickly she could give notice at the coffee shop and start the transition to her new life. "Tape a week," Rodriguez said, but Sarah. He used her first name for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of personal conviction. "Don't let fear make this decision for you. You've already proven you have more courage than most people will ever possess. Don't let the voice that tells you you're not good enough anymore win this fight."
After the seals left, Sarah found herself going through the motions of her job with a strange sense of detachment. Every task, wiping down counters, restocking supplies, taking orders from customers, felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else perform these actions while her mind wrestled with the monumental decision that had been placed before her. The remainder of the morning shift passed in a blur of automatic responses and distracted service. Her manager, Janet, commented twice on her unusual quietness, but Sarah deflected with vague excuses about being tired. How could she explain that 3 Navy SEALs had just walked into her life and offered her a chance to reclaim her sense of purpose? During her lunch break, Sarah drove to the nearby beach and sat in her car, staring out at the ocean while Rodriguez's business card lay in her palm like a small piece of destiny. The weight of the Bronze Star against her chest seemed to have doubled since the morning's encounter, as if the medal were demanding acknowledgement after months of being hidden away. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison's story, how he'd sat in a VA parking lot with his service weapon, contemplating ending his own pain. The image terrified her because she recognized how easily she could have ended up in a similar place. The slow fade into insignificance that she'd experienced over the past 8 months was its own kind of death, just more gradual and socially acceptable than suicide.
The ocean waves rolled in steady rhythm, and Sarah found herself remembering the first time she'd seen the sea after returning from her final deployment. She'd expected to feel relief, peace, the satisfaction of a warrior coming home. Instead, she'd felt empty, disconnected from the civilian world that seemed to be moving around her without any awareness of what she'd experienced or sacrificed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "Haven't heard from you in a while, sweetheart. How's the coffee shop job going?" Sarah stared at the message, realizing that her mother, who had been so proud when Sarah received the Bronze Star, had no idea her daughter was slowly disappearing behind a coffee shop counter. The decorated war hero her family had celebrated had been replaced by someone who measured her daily success by how many lattes she could make without screwing up the foam art. She thought about the statistics Rodriguez had shared, 22 veteran suicides per day. The number felt abstract until she started putting faces on it, remembering fellow corpsmen and Marines from her deployments who had struggled with similar demons. How many of them were out there right now, sitting in their cars or apartments, trying to decide whether tomorrow was worth the effort? As Sarah sat there wrestling with her decision, she realized that the SEALs had offered her something she hadn't even known she lost, the opportunity to be needed again. For months, she'd been replaceable, forgettable, just another minimum wage worker in the vast machinery of civilian economy. But Rodriguez and his team were telling her that her specific skills, experiences, and even her pain made her uniquely qualified to save lives in a different way. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her military career running toward danger to help wounded Marines, and now she was being asked to run toward a different kind of battlefield to help wounded veterans. The enemy was different: depression, despair, isolation instead of insurgents and IEDs. But the mission was fundamentally the same: preserve life, restore hope, bring people home. Sarah pulled out her phone and found herself scrolling through news articles about veteran suicide rates, PTSD treatment programs, and the ongoing crisis facing returning service members. The statistics were overwhelming, but they also crystallized something important in her mind. This wasn't just about her personal journey from despair to purpose. It was about addressing a national crisis that was claiming the lives of people she'd once served alongside. She thought about the 3 Marines she'd been unable to save in Helmand Province: Johnson, Martinez, and Davidson. Their names were carved into her memory like epitaphs, constant reminders of her limitations and failures. But what if she could prevent other Marines, other veterans from becoming casualties of a different kind of war? What if the skills that hadn't been enough to save those 3 men could be used to save dozens or hundreds of others who were fighting battles with invisible enemies? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Phoenix Rising represented a chance to turn her greatest failure into her greatest mission, to transform the guilt that had been consuming her into a force for healing others. It was an opportunity to honor the memory of the Marines she'd lost by ensuring that other veterans didn't become casualties of their own despair. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail from Janet at the coffee shop, asking if she could come in early for the evening shift because another employee had called in sick. The request felt like a symbol of everything wrong with her current life. She was valuable only when someone else failed to show up, needed only to fill gaps in other people's schedules. But Rodriguez's offer represented something entirely different, being needed for who she was, not just for her availability. The Phoenix Rising program needed her specific skills, her particular combination of medical training and combat trauma, her understanding of what it meant to carry the weight of lives lost and lives saved. As the sun began to set over the ocean, Sarah made her decision. She pulled out her Rodriguez business card and dialed the number before she could change her mind. "Rodriguez?" came the crisp, military answer after 2 rings. "Master Chief, this is Sarah Chen. I've made my decision." She paused, feeling the weight of the moment. "When do I start?"
The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for what felt like an eternity before Rodriguez's voice came back, warmer and more personal than Sarah had heard it before. "Doc, are you sure? This isn't a decision you want to make lightly.
Once you're in, once you start working with these veterans, their lives become part of your responsibility. It's not something you can walk away from easily. Sarah looked out at the ocean, watching the waves crash against the shore with relentless determination. Master Chief, I've been walking away from responsibility for 8 months. I've been hiding from who I am and what I'm capable of. I'm tired of being afraid of my own strength. She could hear Rodriguez conferring with someone in the background before he came back on the line. All right, Doc, can you be at our facility this Saturday for a tour and initial interview? I want you to see what you're signing up for before we make this official. I'll be there, Sarah said, feeling a surge of determination that reminded her of accepting her first combat deployment. What should I bring? Just yourself and an open mind. And Doc, bring that bronze star. Not hidden under your shirt this time. The veterans we work with need to see what real heroism looks like. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car for another few minutes, processing the magnitude of what she just committed to. In the space of a single day, her entire future had shifted from the mundane routine of coffee shop work to the possibility of meaningful service to fellow veterans. The change felt both sudden and long overdue, like a dam finally giving way after months of pressure. She drove back to the coffee shop for her evening shift, but everything felt different now. The familiar environment seemed smaller, more confining, like clothes she'd outgrown but had continued wearing out of habit. As she tied her apron and went through the motions of preparing for the dinner rush, Sarah found herself studying her coworkers with new eyes. Janet, her manager, was a kind woman in her 50s who'd been running coffee shops for most of her adult life. She approached her work with professional competence but little passion, treating it as a job rather than a calling. Marcus, the evening barista, was a college student who viewed the coffee shop as temporary employment while he worked toward his engineering degree. Neither of them had ever experienced anything close to what Sarah had lived through, and neither would understand why she was about to walk away from steady employment for an uncertain future helping traumatized veterans. During a lull between customers, Sarah found herself thinking about what Rodriguez had said about bringing her Bronze Star visible for the veterans to see. The idea terrified her almost as much as it inspired her. For months, she'd kept the medal hidden, treating it like a shameful secret rather than a symbol of honor. The thought of wearing it openly, of allowing it to represent who she was rather than who she used to be, felt like a fundamental shift in how she understood herself. As the evening progressed, Sarah noticed something she'd never paid attention to before. How many customers wore subtle indicators of military service? A Marine Corps bumper sticker visible through the window, a Navy t-shirt under a civilian jacket, the distinctive posture and bearing that marked former military personnel even in civilian clothes. How many of them were struggling with their own transitions? How many were fighting battles with invisible enemies while ordering their evening coffee? One customer, in particular, caught her attention. A young man, probably mid-20s, who ordered black coffee with shaking hands and avoided eye contact. There were fresh needle marks on his arms that he tried to hide with long sleeves, and his eyes had the hollow look Sarah recognized from her own reflection during her darkest moments. He was clearly a veteran, probably recently returned from deployment, and obviously struggling with demons she understood all too well. For a moment, Sarah considered saying something, offering some word of understanding or support, but her current role as a coffee shop barista didn't give her the authority or framework to reach out to struggling veterans. She could only watch helplessly as he took his coffee and left, probably to continue fighting his battles alone. The incident crystallized something important for Sarah. Her decision to join Phoenix Rising wasn't just about her own healing or purpose. It was about being in a position to help veterans like that young man, to be someone who could recognize the signs of distress and actually do something meaningful about them. When her shift ended at 9 o'clock, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave, not because she enjoyed the work, but because walking out of the coffee shop felt like the beginning of the end of this chapter of her life. In 3 days, she would tour the Phoenix Rising facility and begin the process of becoming someone entirely different. Not just a decorated war hero hiding behind civilian anonymity, but a healer actively engaged in the ongoing battle for veteran mental health.
That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment and did something she hadn't done since returning from her final deployment. She took out her Bronze Star medal and held it in her hands, really looking at it for the first time in months. The bronze felt warm against her palms, and the star design seemed to catch the light from her reading lamp in a way that made it appear almost alive. She thought about the night she'd earned it, running through enemy fire in Helmand Province to reach wounded Marines. Each trip across that deadly ground had required a conscious decision to risk her life for someone else's, a choice to prioritize their survival over her own safety. At the time, the decisions had felt automatic, driven by training and instinct rather than conscious heroism. But looking at the medal now, Sarah began to understand what Rodriguez and his team had been trying to tell her. Heroism wasn't just about dramatic moments of life-saving action under enemy fire. It was also about the smaller daily decisions to keep fighting when giving up would be easier. It was about choosing to help others even when you were struggling yourself, about finding ways to turn pain into purpose.
Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, with low clouds hanging over the Blue Ridge Mountains like a protective blanket. Sarah had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with anticipation and anxiety about what she would find at the Phoenix Rising facility. She'd chosen her clothes carefully, civilian attire, but neat and professional, with her Bronze Star medal hanging visibly outside her shirt for the first time since leaving active duty. The drive into the mountains was beautiful despite the cloudy weather. Sarah followed Rodriguez's directions through increasingly rural terrain, past farms and forests that seemed worlds away from the urban environment of Virginia Beach. As she climbed higher into the mountains, she felt some of the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. There was something therapeutic about leaving the crowded coast behind and entering the quiet majesty of the Blue Ridge. The Phoenix Rising facility appeared around a bend in the mountain road, like something from a therapeutic retreat brochure. The main building was a modern structure that managed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment, all wood and glass and stone that complemented rather than competed with the surrounding forest. Several smaller buildings were scattered across the property, connected by paved walking paths that curved around mature trees and natural rock formations. Sarah parked in the visitor area and sat in her car for a moment, gathering her courage. Through the windows of the main building, she could see people moving around, some in civilian clothes, others in military-style workout gear, all of them carrying themselves with the distinctive bearing that marked military personnel. This was a place where her background wouldn't make her different or suspect. It would make her part of a community that understood exactly what she'd experienced. Rodriguez met her at the main entrance, dressed in casual clothes, but still radiating the quiet authority that had impressed her at the coffee shop. "Welcome to Phoenix Rising, Doc," he said, extending his hand. "Ready to see what we're all about?" The interior of the main building was even more impressive than the exterior. The lobby featured high ceilings with exposed wooden beams, comfortable seating areas arranged around a massive stone fireplace, and large windows that provided stunning views of the surrounding mountains. But what struck Sarah most was the atmosphere. There was an energy in the air that spoke of purpose, healing, and mutual support. The design philosophy here is about creating an environment that feels more like a retreat than a medical facility. A lot of our participants have negative associations with traditional VA hospitals and clinical settings. We wanted them to feel like they were coming home rather than reporting for treatment. They passed through a comfortable lounge area where several veterans were engaged in what appeared to be a group therapy session. The conversation was animated, but not heated, with participants leaning forward in their chairs as if genuinely interested in what their peers were saying. I caught fragments of the discussion, references to deployment experiences, family challenges, struggles with civilian employment, all topics she knew intimately from her own experience. "That's one of our peer support groups," Rodriguez said, noticing her attention. "They meet 3 times a week, sometimes more if someone's having a crisis. The facilitator is Dr. Amanda Walsh. She's a licensed therapist, but she's also a former Army captain who did 2 tours in Iraq. The combination of professional training and personal experience makes her incredibly effective."
They continued through the facility, and Rodriguez showed her the medical wing, equipped with examination rooms, a small pharmacy, and treatment areas for both physical and psychological therapy. The equipment was modern and comprehensive, but the decoration and lighting made it feel warm and welcoming rather than sterile and institutional. "This is where you'd be spending a lot of your time," Rodriguez said, gesturing toward the medical facilities. "We have a lot of participants dealing with physical injuries that aren't healing properly because they're not taking care of themselves. Depression and isolation interfere with recovery, so they need someone who understands both the medical and psychological aspects of their conditions." In one of the examination rooms, Sarah met Dr. James Thompson, the facility's chief medical officer. He was an older man with gentle eyes and the kind of bedside manner that immediately put patients at ease. What surprised Sarah was learning that he was a retired Navy flight surgeon who had served multiple deployments in support of Marine Corps operations. "Dr. Chen," he said, using her former military title with obvious respect, "Master Chief Rodriguez has told me about your background. The Angel of Helmand. That's quite a reputation to live up to." Sarah felt her cheeks flush at the nickname, but Dr. Thompson's expression was serious rather than flattering. "The work we do here requires someone who understands trauma from the inside out. Medical knowledge is important, but credibility with our participants is essential. They need to know that the person treating them has walked through the same fire they're struggling with." As they talked, Sarah learned more about the specific challenges facing the veterans in the program. Many had complex combinations of physical injuries, traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, depression, and substance abuse issues. Traditional medical approaches often treated these conditions separately, but Phoenix Rising's model recognized that they were all interconnected aspects of the same trauma. "What we found," Dr. Thompson explained, "is that veterans heal faster when they're treated by other veterans who understand their experiences. There's a level of trust and communication that's almost impossible to achieve with civilian medical personnel, no matter how well-trained or well-intentioned they might be." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from somewhere else in the building, not alarming, but clearly requiring attention. Rodriguez excused himself and returned a few minutes later with a concerned expression. "We've got a situation developing with one of our participants. Jake Morrison is handling it, but it might be instructed for you to observe how we deal with crisis situations. Are you comfortable with that?" Sarah nodded, feeling a familiar surge of adrenaline that reminded her of responding to medical emergencies during her deployments. "What's the situation?" "One of our newer participants, Marine veteran, 3 tours in Afghanistan, just got word that his buddy from his unit committed suicide last night. He's not taking it well, and we're concerned about his immediate safety."
Rodriguez led Sarah quickly through the facility toward what appeared to be a crisis intervention room. As they walked, he provided a brief background on the situation they were about to encounter. The veteran's name is Sergeant Marcus Williams, 26 years old, infantry marine with multiple deployments. He's been with us for about 3 weeks, making good progress with his PTSD and adjustment issues. But this kind of news, losing someone from his unit, can trigger a complete regression. As they approached the room, Sarah could hear voices through the partially open door. One voice was calm and professional, clearly Jake Morrison, while the other was agitated, angry, filled with pain that Sarah recognized all too well. "Why him and not me?" the distressed voice was saying. "Danny had a wife, kids, a whole life waiting for him. I've got nothing. Why am I still here when better Marines are killing themselves?" Through the doorway, Sarah could see Morrison sitting across from a young man who was hunched forward in his chair, his hands covering his face. The body language spoke of complete despair, the kind of crushing emotional weight that could drive someone to make irreversible decisions. "Marcus," Morrison was saying, his voice steady but compassionate, "surviving doesn't make you guilty of anything. Danny made a choice based on pain you can't fully understand, just like you're dealing with pain he couldn't fully understand. Each person's struggle is different." Rodriguez gestured for Sarah to remain in the hallway while he entered the room. She watched through the doorway as he joined the crisis intervention. His presence immediately added another layer of support and authority to the situation. "Sergeant Williams," Rodriguez said, using the Marine's rank as a sign of respect. "I know this feels overwhelming right now, but I need you to focus on something important. Danny wouldn't want his death to trigger yours.
He'd want you to find a way to honor his memory by living, by getting better, by becoming the person he believed you could be. Sarah found herself studying Morrison's technique as he worked with the distressed Marine. There was nothing clinical or detached about his approach. Instead, he spoke with the authority of someone who had been exactly where Williams was now, someone who understood the specific guilt and despair that came with surviving when others didn't. "I've been where you are right now," Morrison said, leaning forward slightly. 3 years ago, I lost my entire team in Syria. 6 guys who were better soldiers and better men than I'll ever be. For months afterward, I couldn't understand why I deserved to survive when they didn't. Williams looked up for the first time, his eyes red with tears, but focused on Morrison with desperate attention. This was exactly what Dr. Thompson had been talking about, the credibility that came from shared experience, the connection that was impossible to fake or manufacture. "What changed?" Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I realized that survivor's guilt was just another way of making their deaths about me. The truth is, they died because war is hell, and sometimes good people don't make it home. I survived because of luck, because of their sacrifice, because of 1,000 factors I'll never fully understand. But staying alive and getting better, that became my way of honoring them." Rodriguez caught Sarah's eye and gestured for her to join them in the room. As she entered, both Morrison and Williams looked at her with curiosity. The Bronze Star medal hanging outside her shirt was immediately visible, and she saw recognition dawn in Williams' eyes. "Sergeant Williams," Rodriguez said, "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, former Navy corpsman. She earned that Bronze Star with Valor Device for actions in Helmand Province, where she saved 17 Marines in a single night." Williams straightened slightly in his chair, his Marine Corps training automatically responding to the presence of a decorated veteran. But I could see that his distress was still overwhelming, that the news of his friend's suicide had shattered whatever progress he'd been making. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down, positioning herself at Williams' eye level rather than standing over him. It was a technique she had learned during her medical training, reducing the physical power differential to encourage trust and communication. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I lost 3 Marines that night in Helmand. Johnson, Martinez, and Davidson. Everyone talks about the 17 I saved, but they forget about the 3 I couldn't reach in time. For months after I got back, I couldn't understand why I deserved to come home when they didn't." The effect of her words was immediate. Williams looked at her with new attention, studying her face as if trying to reconcile the decorated war hero with someone who understood his specific pain. "How do you deal with it?" he asked, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone looking for any lifeline in a sea of despair. Sarah thought carefully before answering. This was her first real test as a potential member of the Phoenix Rising team, her first opportunity to use her experience to help another veteran navigate the treacherous waters of survivor's guilt. "I don't deal with it," she said honestly. "I live with it. There's a difference. Johnson, Martinez, and Davidson are part of me now, part of my story, part of my responsibility. Not because I failed them, but because I survived, and they didn't. My job now is to make sure their sacrifice meant something." She paused, studying Williams' expression. "Your friend, Danny, what would he want you to do with your life?" Williams was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down his face. "He'd want me to get better. He'd want me to stop drinking, stop isolating myself, maybe go back to school like he always said I should." "Then that's how you honor him," Sarah said simply, "not by joining him in death, but by living the kind of life he believed you were capable of living. That's how you make his sacrifice mean something." The room fell silent except for the sound of Williams crying, not the desperate sobs of someone on the edge of a breakdown, but the cleansing tears of someone beginning to process grief in a healthy way. The crisis intervention session continued for another hour, with Morrison and Rodriguez taking turns supporting Williams, while Sarah observed and occasionally contributed insights from her own experience. By the end of the session, Williams had committed to staying at the facility and continuing his treatment program, understanding that his friend's death was a tragedy, but not a reason to abandon his own recovery. As they left the crisis intervention room, Rodriguez turned to Sarah with an expression of approval and respect.
That was exactly what I was hoping to see, Doc. You connected with him in a way that civilian therapists never could. That's the kind of intervention that saves lives. Sarah felt a familiar surge of satisfaction, the same feeling she'd experienced after successful medical procedures during her deployments. But this was different. Instead of treating physical wounds, she'd helped treat the psychological wounds that were often more dangerous and harder to heal. "How often do situations like that come up?" she asked as they continued the tour of the facility. "More often than we'd like," Morrison replied, rejoining them after ensuring Williams was settled and surrounded by support staff. "The veteran suicide epidemic is real, and it's getting worse. We probably deal with at least one crisis intervention per week, sometimes more. Having someone with your background and credibility available 24/7 would be invaluable." They spent the next 2 hours touring the rest of the facility, including the residential dormitories where veterans could stay during intensive treatment programs, the outdoor adventure therapy areas where participants engaged in challenging physical activities designed to rebuild confidence and teamwork skills, and the vocational training facilities where veterans learned new skills for civilian careers. Sarah was particularly impressed by the adventure therapy program, which included rock climbing walls, rope courses, and wilderness survival training. The activities were designed to help veterans rediscover their physical capabilities while working through psychological trauma in a supportive group environment. Physical challenges help veterans rebuild their sense of competence and self-efficacy, explained Dr. Walsh, the former Army captain who ran the adventure therapy program. "Many of our participants have lost confidence in their abilities after struggling with civilian life. These activities help them remember that they're still capable of overcoming difficult obstacles." As the tour concluded, Rodriguez led Sarah to his office for a final conversation about the position. The office was spartanly decorated, but comfortable, with military memorabilia sharing space with family photos and certificates from various humanitarian organizations. "So what do you think, Doc? Is this something you could see yourself doing?" Rodriguez asked, settling into his chair. Sarah looked out the window at the mountains surrounding the facility, thinking about Williams's crisis that morning and the way her words had seemed to reach him when clinical interventions might have failed. She thought about the young veteran with needle marks who'd bought coffee from her just a few nights ago, and how different his story might be if he had access to the kind of support Phoenix Rising provided. "I think this is exactly what I've been looking for," she said. "This is where I can use my experience to make a real difference in people's lives." Rodriguez smiled, but his expression remained serious. "Before you make a final commitment, I want you to understand exactly what you're signing up for. This work will be emotionally demanding in ways that combat medicine never was. You'll be dealing with veterans who are fighting battles with invisible enemies, and sometimes you'll lose those battles, despite your best efforts." He paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. "You'll also be confronting your own demons on a daily basis. Working with traumatized veterans means constantly revisiting your own trauma, examining your own recovery process, and staying vigilant about your own mental health. It's not work you can leave at the office." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was describing. But she also understood something else. This was exactly the kind of challenge she needed, the kind of meaningful work that could transform her own pain into purpose. "Master Chief, I've been running away from my demons for 8 months. Maybe it's time I started fighting them alongside other people who understand what that battle looks like." Rodriguez extended his hand across the desk. "Welcome to Phoenix Rising, Dr. Chen. When can you start?" "I need to give 2 weeks' notice at the coffee shop, but I can start the training program immediately if you have evening or weekend sessions available." "We'll make it work," Rodriguez assured her. "The sooner we can get you integrated into the team, the sooner you can start making a difference in veterans' lives." As she drove back down the mountain toward Virginia Beach, she felt a sense of anticipation and purpose that had been missing from her life for months. The Bronze Star medal hanging outside her shirt caught the afternoon sunlight coming through her windshield, no longer a hidden reminder of past glory, but a visible symbol of ongoing commitment to service. She thought about Williams and the crisis he had faced that morning, and how her own experience with survivor's guilt had allowed her to reach him in a way that might have saved his life. The realization that her pain could be transformed into a tool for healing others felt like a revelation, a way to honor both the Marines she'd saved and the ones she'd lost.
For the first time since returning from her final deployment, Sarah Chen felt like she was coming home.
2 weeks later, Sarah Chen walked into Brewed Awakening coffee shop for the final time as an employee. She'd already cleaned out her locker and said goodbye to most of her coworkers, but she wanted one last moment in the place that had been her refuge during the darkest period of her life. Janet, her manager, met her at the counter with a mixture of sadness and confusion. "I still can't believe you're leaving for another medical job," she said, shaking her head. "I had no idea you were so overqualified for this position." Sarah smiled, realizing that Janet still didn't fully understand what she was walking away from or what she was walking toward. How could she explain that the quiet woman who'd been making coffee and taking orders for 8 months was actually a decorated combat veteran who'd saved 17 lives in a single night? How could she convey that she was leaving not because she was too good for the coffee shop, but because she'd finally remembered who she was meant to be? Sometimes you need to step away from who you were to figure out who you're supposed to become, Sarah said, tying her apron one last time. "This place gave me the space to heal. Now I'm ready to help other people do the same." As she worked through her final shift, Sarah found herself studying the familiar environment with new eyes. The espresso machine that had startled her with its sudden hissing now seemed benign, even friendly. The routine tasks that had once felt meaningless now represented a necessary pause in her journey, a time when she'd learned to be still long enough to understand what came next. The morning rush brought its usual collection of customers, including several military personnel from the nearby base. But today, instead of seeing them as reminders of a life she'd left behind, Sarah saw them as members of a community she was about to rejoin in a new capacity. Some of them might need the services Phoenix Rising provided. Some of them might be struggling with their own transitions from military to civilian life. Around mid-morning, a familiar group entered the coffee shop. Rodriguez, Morrison, and Peterson, the 3 SEALs who had changed her life 2 weeks earlier. They approached the counter with the same purposeful demeanor she remembered, but this time their expressions carried warmth and anticipation rather than professional assessment. "Dr. Chen," Rodriguez said formally, though his eyes were smiling, "we're here for your graduation ceremony." Sarah looked at him with confusion. "Graduation ceremony?" Morrison stepped forward, producing a small gift box from his pocket. "Every member of the Phoenix Rising team receives one of these when they officially join our mission. It's a tradition we started 3 years ago." Sarah opened the box to find a small pin depicting a phoenix rising from flames, identical to the logo she'd seen on Rodriguez's business card. But this pin was made of bronze and designed to be worn alongside military decorations. The symbolism was unmistakable. This represented her own resurrection from the ashes of despair and purposelessness. The phoenix has always been a symbol of renewal and rebirth. But for us, it also represents the idea that some things have to be burned away before something better can emerge. Your time here, he gestured around the coffee shop, wasn't wasted time. It was the fire that burned away everything that wasn't essential, leaving only what you needed to become who you're meant to be. As Sarah pinned the phoenix pin just below her Bronze Star medal, she felt the symbolic weight of the gesture. For months, the Bronze Star had felt like a relic from someone else's life, a reminder of heroism she couldn't reclaim. But now, combined with the phoenix pin, it represented continuity rather than loss. The same courage and commitment to service expressed in a new form. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the tone he used for important announcements. "Dr. Thompson wanted me to tell you that your first assignment at Phoenix Rising will be developing a program specifically for corpsmen and medics dealing with survivor's guilt. Based on your interaction with Sergeant Williams, we think you're uniquely qualified to address that particular aspect of combat trauma." The assignment felt perfect, as if everything in Sarah's experience had been preparing her for exactly this role. Her medical training, her combat experience, her own struggle with survivor's guilt, even her months of hiding in the coffee shop.
All of it had contributed to her qualification for helping other medical personnel work through the complex emotions that came with being unable to save everyone. "When do I start?" Sarah asked, already mentally preparing for the transition from coffee shop worker to veteran counselor. "Your training begins Monday. 6 months of intensive preparation in trauma counseling, crisis intervention, and program development. But Sarah," he used her first name with obvious respect, "the real training started the day you earned that Bronze Star. Everything we're going to teach you is just building on the foundation you already have." As her shift ended and Sarah prepared to leave the coffee shop for the final time, Janet approached her with an envelope. "This came for you yesterday. I forgot to give it to you until now." The envelope contained a thank you card from a customer Sarah barely remembered, a young veteran who'd come in regularly for black coffee and had apparently noticed something in her demeanor that had helped him feel less alone during his own difficult transition. The card simply read, "Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Your kindness made a difference." Sarah stared at the card, realizing that even during her darkest period, when she'd felt purposeless and forgotten, she'd still been making a difference in people's lives. The quiet compassion she'd shown to struggling customers, the understanding in her eyes when she'd served other veterans, the simple fact of her presence, all of it had mattered more than she'd known. As she walked out of Brewed Awakening for the last time, Sarah Chen felt the weight of both her medals against her chest. The Bronze Star representing her past heroism, and the Phoenix Pin representing her future mission. The Angel of Hellmand was ready to fly again, but this time, her mission wasn't to save lives on a battlefield. It was to save lives from the invisible enemies that continued fighting long after the shooting stopped. Behind her, the coffee shop hummed with its usual morning energy, serving customers who had no idea that the woman who had been making their coffee for 8 months was actually a decorated war hero embarking on a new chapter of service. But the mountains of Virginia beckoned, promising a future where her pain could become purpose, where her experience could become healing, and where the Angel of Hellmand could continue her mission of bringing wounded warriors home. 3 days later, Sarah Chen began her new life at Phoenix Rising, ready to help other veterans discover that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely before you can find out who you're really meant to be. The coffee shop was behind her, but the service would never end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.